My name is Barbara Gannon. I'm the Associate Professor of History here. I'm the coordinator of the Veterans History Project. I do military history, Civil War memory, all sorts of things. And I will be your host for tonight.
My name is Grande. I served 4 years in the United States Marine Corps. I am a graduate student here, and I'm also the project manager for the Veteran History Project, and I am going to be assisting Dr. Gannon in this presentation.
Okay, our agenda. The armed services, missions, including a history lesson, structure, including the reserves, often forgotten, ranks, jobs, and medals. John's going to handle a lot of that. The Warfighter, not the armed services. It's kind of our spoiler alert. Joint Commands, the Department of Defense, DOD. You say it's one word, DOD. Not DOD. All acronyms are said as a word, particularly for our Navy friends. The budget, what everyone cares about, buying expensive stuff, what really nobody cares about, operations and maintenance, that's very important, and what really costs money, personnel. And then we'll have some questions. So we don't have a small group. What brought you here? What are you interested in our Military 101?
So I'm in the Security Studies PhD program, as Dr. Dolan recommended, and I'm wondering who the rest of my peers are, that we come to this since this is kind of what we, at least in some part, study, since we do the not-so-peaceful parts of international relations.
I have an MA in Security Policy Studies, oddly enough.
Right. And truth be told, I'm actually active duty Army, and so I was curious to see what the academic viewpoint of the organization was.
Well, this is maybe the academics, because academics don't know much. This is more the Security Policy Studies, worked in the Gov a long time as a defense analyst.
Sure, okay.
What I would like everyone to know when they think about defense issues.
Okay.
I just thought it'd be an interesting presentation. So we have, we're trying to professionalize to get ready to go into graduate school. He's only in my third year. And so I thought that this would be a good presentation. And I'm hoping to get a PhD in history. And so I'll be taking classes with you, so.
There you go. I say begin early. Ma'am.
I'm here for the sake of diversity. This workshop was advertised for possible DEUs, diversity education units.
Good.
I'm interested in different cultures and backgrounds, so why not getting informed about the military this time?
That's a good one. It's a good culture to understand. And you, I know, are in my class.
Yes, besides the extra credit. I'm running a sci-fi series where the majority, I'd say, characters are military, and it's good for me to write. I prefer also to research as much military information as possible while writing.
All right. Well, thank you. And I'll introduce back, we have Tiffany Rivera, who keeps us all in line.
And I'm here for professional development today.
And Tyler Campbell, social media guru of the Veterans History Project and so many other things. All right. In the beginning, there was an army. Air Force doesn't come for a while. Spoiler alert again. Now, it wasn't really the army, it was the militia for each town in the colonies. Or when there was an expedition elsewhere, they often formed volunteers. They would call them provisional volunteer units, but they were often drawn from the militia. So think kind of amateur hour. The British Navy and Army fought wars overseas in Europe, but sometimes they spilled over here because there were the French were in Canada, for example, the Spanish were in Florida, so often their wars spilled over. Despite that, you're thinking to yourself, well, we must be thanking British Army veterans everywhere. No, we did not like them. And we had some good reasons, I think. This is sort of the first picture, they say, of a militia muster. You notice the guns are what they call arquebuses. They would put them on almost a tripod. They even have a pike in this, which isn't really useful in European warfare. I do like the cat, though. Cat videos, even in 1637. So that's where the National Guard of today traces its origins. And you can see the sort of the very European, even the helmets. But that would be changed and transformed as American militia and other soldiers have to get used to fighting in woods against Native Americans. So, Revolutionary War, we fought the British Army. And we needed a better army. The militia didn't do it. I know we have this sort of memory of the militia winning the war, the Minutemen. It's a Continental Army, which is kind of, they weren't a professional army, but they were long-serving volunteers. They were as close as we're going to get. We get a Navy, a small one, and we get Marines with the Navy, because initially Marines, my job is just to be on a ship, to provide security and maybe to land with sailors. We kept the militias, and they did home defense. For example, the Battle of Saratoga, which is in upstate New York, often they would call the militia out because they would defend against the British in local areas. But the key figures of the Continental Army. That would be Continental Army uniforms. Now, after the war, the Revolutionary War, which remember we fought against standing armies. We didn't like standing armies. And I have no idea to the extent to which the regular army is nothing in America in the 19th century. It's those people who are thankfully on the frontier. We destroy the army and we tend to rely on militias. Because militias won the Revolutionary War, didn't they? Well, when we look back at it, we look differently, but the Minutemen, Lexington and Concord in those 8 years afterwards, till we had a treaty with the British, I don't know who was fighting them. Native American wars go on all through the 19th century, up to about 1890, and there's a small regular army on the frontier mostly, in god-awful places. The Navy is better. The Navy is always better in this era, because we are a seagoing power. We see ourselves surrounded by oceans, which isn't stupid. We have merchant interests, so we always have a better, more professional Navy. The War of 1812. Oh God, when I lecture this one, I just put a bag over my head and I say, oh, well then the Canadians beat us again and the Navy fought well. It does better, but it's very small. In fact, it goes head to head with British Navy, the Royal Navy, and wins. Single ship actions, which is just not heard of. But it gets bottled up pretty quickly by the oversized British Navy. The Army militia, we must say, is so bad they burned Washington, or excuse me, the White House more particularly. They're very particular on who they're burning. They know it's Madison's house. The Army stays small during the entire 19th century. The Navy is always better, it has to be, because you can't, a militiaman can say, well, you're the local most powerful person, you command the militia. You have to have a technically trained person or you're going to run your ship aground, break the sails, and you're sick in the storm. So our Navy tends to be more professional at this time, because it must be. And I think, quite frankly, we make a very good calculation of our own national security interest, that a strong Navy is important to a nation surrounded by oceans with important mercantile interests overseas. So that is a 1912 action. The Constitution versus the Guerrier, a British ship. Now, volunteers expand the Army. Now, this is when we get to a different idea. There's militia. Everyone in Durham, Massachusetts, Gannon, belongs to the militia. The volunteers are only the people who want to enlist and go elsewhere. Sometimes they are voluntold, i.e., they are militiamen who are told they must serve with the volunteers, but they're usually volunteers. So the Mexican War, you had volunteer units. You have a volunteer unit from the 1st Mississippi Rifles, say. That was Jeff Davis, who we President of the Confederacy unit. The Civil War is all volunteers. If there are Army regulars, U.S. Army regulars, but they're a very small part of the people who serve. They do expand it. It's mainly fought by volunteers. Spanish-American War. Mostly fought by regulars, but some very high-flying volunteers like Teddy Roosevelt. The Rough Riders were a volunteer unit that were organized from the territories places like Arizona and New Mexico. The Philippine-American War, volunteers, and some regulars. The Navy is still better throughout this whole time. But again, part of it is not a part-time thing. And Americans put more money and more thought into that. This is the American way in the 19th century. And they're going to have learned from all these wars. They're going to say, why any man, any American can be a soldier. All you got to do is put a gun in their head and they're damn moon. They can shoot anyone. Those regulars just get in the way. West Point was under a lot of fire, particularly during the Civil War. It's just too stodgy. They don't know how to command American troops. And that is the way Americans thought. So in this, you have 16,000 American soldiers, total regulars before the Civil War. You have 26,000 before the Spanish-American War. So this is the 19th century. In the 20th century, the Spanish-American War and the Philippine War made us a world power. We had colonies, so we're going to have to be bigger. We're going to be a world power. We already are an economic powerhouse, but we now have responsibilities overseas. So we have a larger army, though not large enough for World War I and II, a large effective navy. By the beginning of World War I, our entrance, we have the second largest navy in the world. The United States Marine Corps grows large and stays large. This is more during World War II. In World War I, during battles like Belloy Wood, it found its ground force mission. It starts thinking of itself and being organized as a separate ground force. The U.S. Air Force is born in 1947. It was from air units in the Army. You have the Coast Guard and the Merchant Marines. People forget those. They are armed services in the wartime. So these are the different, you see, you get more different types. They get more independence, they change missions. And this is all about the United States, as I always joke in my class, Team America World Police. When you become that, you can't have 16,000 people. So, looking at their mission, the Army is the primary ground force. It consists of combined arms, infantry, armored artillery, aviation, and support units. The Navy is the primary provider of naval power. Ships, submarines, aircraft, and their support. The Air Force is the primary provider of air power, aircraft, bombers, fighters, transportation, reconnaissance, missiles. The Marine Corps, amphibious capability, I haven't used that as much lately, a supplemental ground force, infantry, armor, aviation, and much more limited support units. For example, there are no medics in the Marines. They are Navy personnel who are detailed. The Army, in an operation, say like Iraqi freedom attack, the Army would supply support to the Marines as part of its mission. So, these are, but it gets very complicated because, as you'll notice, the Army has an Air Force, the Navy has an Air Force, the Air Force has an Air Force, and the Marine has an Air Force. And the Coast Guard has an Air Force. All of them use the same kind of capability. But usually, they're, how can I say this, they're partnered. For example, Marine aviation is about supporting Marines. It doesn't have a strategic capability to bomb on countries or continents. The Army has an Air Force, it's usually reconnaissance or helicopters. It relies on the Air Force for other missions. So there seems to be duplication, but there isn't. Any questions on anything I've said so far? This is pretty straightforward, but you'd be surprised how many people, we have a little more experts here. So let's talk about the force structure. That's what an Army person or a military person, what's your force structure? It's kind of an opaque, much more complex than it sounds word, but I'm going to try to keep it straightforward. United States Army, most people know divisions. There's way more to it than that, but let's talk about divisions. There's the 82nd Airborne Division, the 3rd Infantry Division. Take those two, for example. Hard fighting units. A division, though, is composed of combat elements, armor or infantry brigades, battalions. It's like, for example, you have a signal battalion, you might have a medical battalion. You have a battalion, and their job within the division is to support the combat people in it. Divisions, the brigades, the armored or infantry brigade, which usually some have more, what the difference is, some have more tanks than others. A light infantry brigade, like an airborne division, will have few, if none, no tanks. So you have this sort of, you have a design to it. That it's not just a division, but it's a division designed for a purpose. And to do its job, it needs combat people of various types, and it needs support people. For example, to bring in supplies, to take care of its sick, to signal, provide signal capability. So a division is like a unit that can support itself, but not fully. It needs a lot of other units behind the lines to push in supplies. For example, the division will have some form of hospital care, but it'll also have helicopters that will take people to hospitals at other levels that have more capability. But most people think of the Army in divisions. Okay. So I just put up, these are the sort of structure. Now there's, you have SF and Special Operations Forces. We'll talk a little bit about those. And you'll have Special Forces, you'll have Rangers. You have this, they have different functions that have to do with not exactly high intensity conflict, i.e. the Special Forces will assist people to defend themselves. You'll send a team in, and that team will teach locals all of these different functions, and they'll assist them. Whereas Rangers might take on a sort of more, I guess it will be a commando raid or something. It's a little different. You have 4 light divisions, they'll have virtually no tanks. 101st will have lots of helicopters. The 82nd Airborne will jump out of a plane for no reason that I've ever been able to discern at all.
It's fun.
Because the plane will land, doesn't it?
Well, you assume it's the Air Force Base, so you never can be sure.
Well, mostly. Like
You should
mostly,
slow down,
really,
Dustin,
almost
jump
all
out.
the time, as in the plan is to land. And I will jump if it isn't going to. 6 heavy divisions, which are mixes, which usually have things like tanks and fighting vehicles and such. And then a separate brigade. So these are sometimes specialized, but you can deploy these. Like, so one is in Italy and supports that region. The 11th ACR is a separate brigade, but it is a OPFOR. It means it acts in another function. So they can theoretically act on their own, those people. The 2nd ACR and the 3rd ACR. So, okay, when you look at that, you also notice there's patches and they come from history. For example, the Big Web Run was really the first modern division that was deployed. It went to France, it was made of regulars, and so it won. I mean, they were really creative here. And it's always been its patch like that since World War I, even though I think in World War I it was just like a 1. So they all have historical origins, all American. The 82nd during World War I was a patchwork of different units, all American. So you have different, even though this is the 3rd ID, the Rock of the Marne, and there's always kind of joke names, and this is the TV test pattern. People will jokingly call that. So they have, the patches have a historical meaning, and they're very important to the people in the units. The Navy, ships, fleets, wings, expeditionary strike groups. Right now we have 3, yes.
Dr. Gannon, what is a regiment? Where does a regiment come in with the structure?
Okay, a regiment is a very old term for practical military speaks. There were regiments in the Revolution, there were regiments in the War of 1812, but not like, the real modern regiment is kind of sort of born after that, when you had like regular army regiments, like the 6th Infantry. And then during the Civil War, mostly everyone was organized into a regiment. There was 3 to 5 were part of a brigade. There was part of a division, but it isn't like the divisions we're talking about. It's just a mass of people without much support. Now, nowadays we have regiments. And during World War II, there was this thing like the Nisei, the Japanese were organized in the 442nd, and they called it a regiment. It was an independent regiment, but it was more like a brigade. So a regiment was 1,000 people, and in modern times, it sort of shifted because things became about battalions or brigades. And the regiment after World War II was only like a history thing. Like the 7th Cavalry Regiment from Little Bighorn is an element of the 1st Air Cav. Now, it's not the same number of people, the same type, but it keeps its lineage and heritage. It will be a battalion. It will still have a battalion, a brigade organization, but the regiments, and these sort of kept the name ACR, Armored Cavalry Regiment, but they're actually brigades. So we've kept the name out of, you have to understand there's, how can I say this? It's kind of, the military is very sentimental and historical. In tracing units back, their lineage to your unit is a big deal. Like the oldest unit, the National Guard traces its lineage back to that 1637 muster. An old Army Reserve unit traces its lineage back to George Washington's engineering unit. So we've kept the name regiment, but mostly things are either battalions, so you might have the 1st 505, that's in the 82nd. That'll be a battalion that's carrying the lineage of the regiment. And those are, for all intents and purposes, separate brigades. They're not really regiments. A regiment would be smaller and not as capable. Did I answer that? Thank you. Sure. The Navy has ships, obvious, fleets, a group of ships, and wings. Whoa, wings, that sounds like the Air Force. Well, on a ship, an aircraft carrier, you have a wing that is operating off of it. You also have what they call expeditionary strike groups. You say, well, we got a job to do. We got to rescue civilians in Liberia. Or, let's take the news, we have to rescue Americans who are in Yemen. You have to put together, it's kind of like, you say, well, I'll need this kind of ship that can land helicopters. I'll need this that can hold civilians. I'll need these ships to protect it. You come up with a menu. Now, a carrier battle group is basically a big carrier and all the ships to support it, to make sure it doesn't get into trouble. So that would be a carrier battle group. So most of the time, when you don't send 3 carriers, you send 3 battle groups. So you have, and here, I see, let's see, a destroyer, I think it's a cruiser, there's probably a submarine hiding somewhere. You know, the idea is that they can defend the carrier if needed. Now, in modern times, past World War II, past kamikazes, hasn't actually been needed that much, but I guess it's handy. So yes, so you don't send the carrier out on its own. You send it, it will also have, there's probably in there, maybe that ship, a ship that carries its supplies. Or maybe there's an oiler for those ships. It could be a nuclear carrier, so it doesn't need to be gassed up. Air Force has squadrons and groups and wings and numbered air forces, which is a much larger group. So, and even has something called an element, which is like a flight as an element, 2 planes, a flight 4 planes, a squadron 12, and that's planes, but there's also weather squadrons. And there's a security group. There are, the Air Force, when you deploy an Air Force, a bunch, say 12, or say 24, or say 36 planes, they go with about 1,000 people to repair them, to guard the base, to pay their bills, to order parts. So you only have, the Air Force only has a certain number of planes, but it's got all of these people because we have a very technical service. that does all the stuff that has to be done. And so there, one of the things you see there is you have different kinds of planes. This is a stealth fighter. I think that's an F-35. I think that's like F-15. You see a B-1, and I'm thinking, man, they're both B-1s. It just looks like so smaller. I guess it's the angle I'm looking at. I'm like, wait a minute. So you have bombers and you have fighters. But you also have planes that move things. Tactically, the C-130. You ever seen this big old plane with propellers? Or you have C-5Bs, which are big. You can drive Coburn Hall into it and deploy it somewhere, which I don't know why you do it, but okay, just in case. You can drive a tank into it. So they have elements that move things. They have refueling tankers. All of those guys, they don't have to come down for fuel. They can come up to a refueling plane, and he drops the nozzle, overcharges them, asks them if they want coffee. Okay, none of that happens, but okay. And they can refuel in the air. And the thing about that, it gives you all the range you like. So they have tankers and bombers and fighters, and all of these people generate enormous needs for people to guard them, to take care of them when they're sick, to pay their bills, order their parts, all of that stuff. The Marine Corps, 3 divisions. That's by law, oddly enough. The Marine Corps is very good with Congress, so it made sure it would always keep 3 divisions, because between the wars it went very small. Now, there's one also, the Reserve Division. It has battalions and companies and brigades and all that other stuff. But they're a little different. The Marines say, they're kind of like the Navy this way. Look, we gotta come up, we got a job. What's the job? We're gonna come up with a unit to do it. Marine Air Ground Task Force, which is, what mix do we need of forces to do the job? So the Marine Expeditionary Force, a MEF, is the biggest. It's kind of like a division, but with so much other stuff, it's hard to make the comparison. But I suppose it's closest. The Marine Expeditionary Brigade is a brigade, but it isn't just a brigade of combat. Like, you'll have to give it a little slice, they'd say, of logistics. And Marines, for good reasons, like to support themselves with aircraft, because they would rely on the Navy, and they're not convinced the Navy would have their, and I say this delicately, that they would be their priority. So historically speaking, the Marine has liked its own tactical air force to support it. And a MEU, as they would say, MED, MEF, MEU, gotta get used to this sort of taking an acronym and making it into a word, is more like a battalion or whatever they need. You don't send a MEF to rescue 200 tourists who are stuck in Yemen. You send a smaller group. And you work with the Navy, and they'll send, maybe they'll just send a LST, a landing ship, for your MEU, because that'll do it sufficiently. Or maybe it's a very bad situation, they'll send a carrier. But you have to task organize. Everyone thinks in this. You have a unit, you create it, you design it, you assign people to it, but a lot of times you end up task organizing for what the mission is. Like, this is a perfect, I thought this was a very good illustration, a MAGTAF, and it goes down and it shows all the different things, like LCACs, or like, I think hovermobile landing craft. And you have helicopters, and you might have Harrier aircraft, but you also have to have logistics packets too. So yes, so you have all these, and what you do is, from that, you would create the proper mix of forces to get the job done. Now, the Army came to this way of thinking later than the Marines did, and they're trying to now, and they're not doing the best job of it, trying to come up to make divisions more useful, more agile. But that's how the Marines think. They have a mission, and they're going to need a mix of forces based on the requirements. Now, all services, we talked about combat, but all services have support units that deploy overseas. Sometimes they're in a division, but sometimes they're what they call corps, which is a bunch of divisions, or theater. Like there'll be a truck unit bringing in supplies from Kuwait to Iraq. You're probably a corps or a theater group, and they just feed it into the divisions. They're training units for recruits. You have a unit which his job is to train a recruit. You have headquarter units that manage things. You might have a headquarters group that runs reservists, or you might have a headquarters unit that runs all Air Force logistics. You have special forces, SEALs, Green Beret, Rangers, all sorts of things that are done for specialized tasks. You have logistics supply managers. You have people who, as we mentioned, should run Air Force logistics or Army. You have specialized school for officers, war colleges, the National Defense University. There are civilians there, but there are also military people there temporarily to learn. There's all sorts of other people. So whenever I look at this, someone will say to me, well, Dr. Gannon, the Army has about, last I looked, about 475,000. I think its end strength's about 475. You say, well, that's a lot of combat. No, it isn't. A good chunk of those have to stay home and train people. They have to run the headquarters. They have to design units. They have to write doctrine, which is the way the Army fights. There's all sorts of people they have to do. Someone has to run the Pentagon. Officers have to take time for training. So when you get down, all comes to all, you only have so many people for a unit that deploys. And then the unit that deploys is a combat unit, or it might be a support unit. So yeah. And so, because we're very technological military, we need a lot of tail. They call tail the support and tooth the combat. Then we start tooth to tail. Now all of them have active and reserve units. There's the Army National Guard, which is different. You saw the picture, 1637. There's an Army and Air Force National Guard. There's an Army Reserve, which came about the turn of the century. 1905, after the Spanish-American War, and it started out being mostly medical. And today, most of your medical in the military is in reserve units, like the Army Reserve has most of the Army medical. The Air National Guard and the Air Force Reserve, now they're weird. This is the strange thing I have to explain to people. So you're thinking to yourself, well, they can't be very good because they only work part-time. Actually, the Air National Guard and the Reserve are often better flyers because they fly. Okay, you're up in your little Delta plane. Ooh, you fly all day, all week. You land it. Oh, it's time for Air Force Reserve duty. I think I'll go over to my transport ship and get in there and fly. How many hours do I have flying? Thousands. The active person won't have that because they're going to be tied to how much money is for gas. So our reservists, because we have such a big civil reserve fleet, the reservists have way more hours in the air. And because the Air Force knows this and not being stupid, there's a much larger percentage of them are full-time people who keep the jets and the planes and everything running. So as the Army, National Guard, Army Reserve only have a very small cadre of full-time people that have to keep people trained, who come one weekend a month, 2 weekends a year, but it's a lot more now, who are part-time. They have a smaller full-time, but the Air National Guard and Air Force Reserve are seamlessly integrated. They have to. The Navy Reserve is very small because it's hard to run a ship part-time. The Marine Corps Reserve is a whole division, so they're fairly robust, and there's a Coast Guard Reserve even. Now you consider the Merchant Marine our reserve all the time. They're our reserve for supplies and for moving things like a division overseas with all its tanks. You have a Sea Lift Command. It's very complicated, but think of the Merchant Marine as always a reserve. So there's always a reserve, and what they are is real force multipliers, because Americans, they like the idea of reserves because they're thinking, wait a minute, didn't we win all these wars with Minutemen? But what's interesting is 20 years ago, everyone would have laughed at you if you thought the Reserve and National Guard would play such an important role in our national defense, and I had many Department of Defense personnel laugh at me even mentioning it. But now they're much more important. They've been much more critical to recent operations. They're part of the operational force, and they've been very critical. So this, if you say to me, okay, everything I've talked about, history, blah, 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 what's really changed recently, I'm going to talk to you about some things that changed in the 80s. It's the role of the National Guard and Reserve. That really slipped on to the American people. They're totally different than that they were 20 years ago. It's a totally different world for them. So you have active and you have reserve, and they are, what kind of units they are? They're just like the units I talked about in the active. There'll be National Guard wings and squadrons. Now, the Navy Reserve doesn't have battle groups, but the Army National Guard has divisions, and they primarily are combat with some support. They have divisions. The Army Reserve has no divisions. It is primarily support, medical, transport, quartermaster, which is like logistics. But they're very critical because, again, we come back to, everyone talks about fighters, I love fighters, but America's designed its military in the way it fights to require all these other things to go along with it. And they're very technical, which means I need a lot of repairmen, I need a lot of repair parts, and they have a high standard for American soldier medical care and food, and all of that feeds into that. In war, they're as important as active combat units, reserve support units. And Air Force Guard and Reserve are as proficient as active. Now I'm going to let John do ranks and such.
Thank you. Okay, so as Dr. Gannon said, we have a big military. Now we need people to run it, and there needs to be some kind of order, otherwise it's going to be a big mess. So the simplest way I can really put this is that you can compare this kind to a football team. The officers would be the coaches. You have a head coach, you have an assistant head coach, and then you have all the coordinators running around. The enlisted would be all the players from, you have depth chart, you have the starters, you have the backups, you have the backups and the backups, kind of sort of thing. So for generals, we'll start with junior officers. So junior officers are typically your 01s to 03, so like a lieutenant, a second lieutenant, first lieutenant, then captain. In between that is field grade, so pretty much from after captain all the way up to general. And your general would, you have four grades of general. It also depends on the branch. Navy, it's admirals. But now moving on to the enlisted, a little more, I won't say complicated, but it's a little more different. Your junior enlisted personnel is usually E1 to E3. So you have, like, say, in the Marine Corps, you have a private first class, and lance corporal. After that, you go from, you have your non-commissioned officers, that's from E4 all the way up to E6, pretty much. And after that is your staff non-commissioned officers. So, staff non-commissioned officer for any branch is usually the backbone of that branch, meaning that all the information needs to get done, everything, all the testing needs to get done is passed down from them. So the general has a vision, he passes it down to the next guy, and then he passes it down to the next guy. And then your junior officers, they get those commands. They're okay, we're gonna pass it down to our non-commissioned officers. And then, so like I said, they're the backbone, they make it get done. These guys pretty much do all the footwork.
Oh wait, you went the other way.
Right.
Let me do this for you. It gets very confusing. You have to have everybody touching the right way. Okay, come on. Up.
Okay, all right. So I got a visual here, okay. So these first three, well actually no, these first three, sorry. These first three would be your junior enlisted. So like I said, from private to private first class to lance corporal. Then you get to you're not commissioned, which is a corporal all the way up. In the Marine Corps, it's a little different. It's from corporal to sergeant, where you get staff sergeant, that's your non-commissioned officers. I mean, your staff non-commissioned officers, and that's just basically the only difference is that it's a little more responsibility, but you're not doing all the footwork, basically.
In the Army, we'd call that senior, but they would start later.
Right. And if you ask any Marine, they say the worst position in the Marine Corps is staff sergeant, because they're right in between and they get all the crap. But it pretty much runs the same way for all the branches, as Dr. Gannon just mentioned. All these guys right here do all the footwork. They're doing all the field day. They're running around picking up trash. They're running around making sure all the tasks basically get done. And these guys are directly in charge of them to make sure it gets done.
So what percent would you say are in those first three? Would you say like 50, 60% of the actual Army, total military would be in the first three?
I believe so, because usually this first term right here will determine whether or not you're going to re-enlist.
That's a Marine thing.
From my experience, that's the tough against.
We'll do the Army version.
Okay. So from here, this is basically when you're going to decide whether or not you're going to re-enlist, because this is when you're getting all the bad tasks. If you decide you're going to re-enlist, you can move up further the ladder, and as you go further the ladder, you're going to notice that there's less and less people, and there's only a certain amount of ranks that are allowed in, say, the Marine Corps. So say you can only have 10 Master Guardian Sergeants in the Marine Corps, which obviously is a lot more than that. But so in order to get promoted, you have to wait for that slot to empty out. And so you're going to notice basically, like I said, going up the ranks, are going to be less and less people in charge.
Now, the other services, don't take the Navy and the Air Force. They're a little squirrely because they rely on specialists and also re-enlistment more than you guys do.
Right.
So there might be more in here. Might be more in here because they're relying on that, people staying in 20 years. So you'll see more of this than that. Now, the Army's a little like that, not as much, but you probably see more people here, specialists, which is kind of not being a non-commissioned officer, but it is the same money.
Right.
Might be the sweet spot. So it really depends. Services are a little different this way. These are all the same pay grades. You get the same money. But each service needs different things. Marines need to run people in and out because you have to be like healthy and young and stuff, right? Like my man here.
Right.
Whereas the other services need, if you run a ship, as petty officer, second class, you need a lot of those because you want a lot of experienced people at fixing engines. So they tend to be more open.
Right.
You know, so it's culture, but these are the ranks. You can just see, now these are really hard to read.
Right.
If you ever go out to an Air Force and Navy base, just bring a card with you. I can't read them barely.
But these ranks on the far right, there's only one of these in each branch.
Oh God, that's a god.
Yeah, they're
I think you have to explain the gods.
So they're the ones that survive the whole
Yes.
thing to make it up here. And even if you survive to here, that doesn't guarantee you're going to make it to the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, because that means you're like God's gift to the Marine Corps and enlisted branches, basically. And it's the same thing for all the other ones.
Everyone at this end is a god.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so here we have our officer ranks. So from here, so the first three, like I mentioned before, are the junior ranks. These, so for the next three is your field grade, and then you have all your generals. The way I remember it when we were taught, well, it's basically the same, is be my little general. So you have brigadier general, major general, lieutenant general, and just general. So kind of works the same way as enlisted. These guys get all the tasks and they work directly with the staff NCOs most of the time.
I know what to do with the staff NCOs.
In order to get promoted, usually you have to test out. It has to go through Congress and all. It's a lot harder to get promoted as an officer. You have a lot more responsibility, but it's more pay and you have a better lifestyle, basically, than you do if you're enlisted. You have more say in everything. But yeah, oh, all right, warrant officers. These guys are squirrely. So, to be a warrant officer, you are enlisted first, and then you have to go through training. You have to apply for it, and you got to test out for it. If you make it, you become a warrant officer. Now, what a warrant officer? So, where they fit into the ranks? So basically, they're in charge. They're above enlisted, but they're not above officers. They're right smack dab in the middle, from my understanding anyway. When I deal with warrant officers in the Marine Corps, every time I saw them, they were on the range, they were handling ammunition, they were handling training. So from my experience, what I've seen, they're mostly in charge of training, logistics, and other sections of the Corps that they need leadership to make sure things get done.
And the Army, the helicopter pilots too.
Right.
In the Army, they tend to be the technical experts in any particular field. So, like she said, they're the majority of helicopter pilots because of the additional training requirements. But then when you talk about people who are the experts on cybersecurity, the real experts in the Army and cybersecurity are warrant officers, because they'll both have the enlisted experience,
right,
and then they get additional layers of schooling. Their leadership responsibilities are more limited than the commissioned officers, and they get more training than the enlisted. So they live in the middle, like you said.
It's a great job. Whoops, you went up too fast.
Okay. So for jobs, I guess as I said before, enlisted and officers, they all have the same mission, but their responsibilities are different. So we have combat jobs, infantry, army, artillery. For instance, say a Marine graduates boot camp, and he's infantry. He's not going to go to MCT like the rest of Marine combat training. He's going to go to school of infantry, and that takes about 9 months to get through. And he can work anywhere from infantry, armor, or artillery. They can be sectioned out to different spots. And then so you have support jobs where I was basically. You can get sent to logistics, you can get sent to medical. All these jobs are very important to make sure the mission gets accomplished. And so as you see, I mean, these are two totally different things, but they rely on each other to get the mission done. And as I said before, officers and enlisted, they have specialized positions in both, but they both rely on each other to get the mission done, and that's what everyone's focused on.
Yeah, like in the Navy is like surface warfare submarine aviators. That's almost a community, is what they call it. Fighter pilot, missile officer. But you have an office, so everyone kind of specializes. There's a weird thing about officers, so you can start as an infantryman and then later become a foreign area specialist. That's very common actually, because they need more lower ranks infantry, and at the higher ranks they need people who are mature to go to and be an attaché in an embassy or something. So whenever you ask someone, which job? What did you do? And most people, it's one or two things. Officers, it can be three. And there's the combat, and they're all different combats in the services, and they have support. But again, support, okay, so for example, you're fighting a battle and there's no ammunition. And, well, that's that. It's over. And that's a truck driver would drive that up from a place where they stored them, which might be run by armored ordnance people, and you all need everyone to do the job. Oops. Again, you are the most annoying. There you go. Okay. We're going back. Why are you going back? We have a very bad relationship. Medals.
Okay, so for medals, you have you get different medals for different things you accomplish in the military. So for here we have for bravery a Medal of Honor, which most people do not survive. But if you do, then you got lucky. The Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, even like other medals such as Bronze Star or anything like that. It's for basically putting your life on the line and doing something extraordinary, basically, and having someone see it happen. For outstanding performance, you can get the Navy Commendation Medal, Meritorious Service Medals. Meritorious Service Medals means you were promoted earlier than what you were supposed to be. You went before a board, and say you're a Lance Corporal, you want to become a corporal real bad. And there's a board that's opened up, and you have to get a really good physical fitness test. You have to know your Marine Corps knowledge, and you have to go in front of this board of usually all sergeant majors and blow their socks off, basically, and do a really good job. And if you do that, then you would get, not only will you get the Meritorious Service Medal, you'll also get promoted to the rank much faster. And it looks really good on your record.
And the Army just did some very good performance. Every service has little quirks, but you'll see that these quirks, they're both different and the same. We'll show you a picture across that.
Then there's also like a NAM, which is the Navy Achievement Medal, which means you did outstanding work in your specific job. And that usually happens before you switch to a different, when you get sent to a different base or a different unit. And also for when you serve in different campaigns or different wars, you'll receive a medal saying that you partook in that war or that campaign.
Yeah, Vietnamese Service Medal, World War II had them, World War II 8. Europe Pacific had them. You would even have a campaign medal if you were in certain specific campaigns that were recognized. But even that's different from service.
Right.
It's a little different, but there's always a category: bravery, performance. You were there.
So for wounds, most definitely be a Purple Heart means you were wounded in combat. You have the marksman. Every branch has similar ones. I know Army, marksman, sharpshooter, and
Expert.
Okay, so the same thing as Marine Corps. And so you get awards for those, basically saying how good when you have to go to the right ranks to qualify every year. That basically shows how good of a shot you are. Then there's also the high proficiency. So you have combat infantrymen and master jump wings, or even like people who have been submarine tours. They have those little medals, and also
Right.
airborne. They get these little medals that signify that they've been part of this special unit.
So this tells you how complicated medals are. The Military Times has all of them. Now, and the reason, one of the things you'll notice is they're in this row, and that's a precedence. They're in order of precedence. So if you have a bunch, you have to have them exactly a certain way. And foreign medals are after U.S. getting medals. So if you want to read someone's, say you see someone, you see their chest, you'll see a little ribbon like this. Its color for the ribbon will be like that. Will be the color, you'll have a ribbon they're wearing. This is like for dress uniforms. They have little ones when you're wearing this sort of, think of it as a dining jacket. But here you'll see, imagine a ribbon like that, or a ribbon like that. Like there's a Purple Heart. There's a Bronze Star. So that is the precedence, and that's very important to wear them right, in the right order. There's a lot of rules and customs that you have to get used to, but that's what people are wearing. And this is my bag. Surprise! None of these services are called a warfighter. They're like, did I just pay these people to have ships and planes? Really? Well, because they don't command services in combat. Their services exist to organize, train, and equip. That's their job. They are assigned to a warfighter. The Chief of Staff of the Army does not leave men and women in battle. The end. They're supposed to have the best army ever for people to do that. The role is played by the combat commander, who belongs to a service. He might be an Army guy or Navy guy. But his authority is derived because he's appointed to that command. The Joint Commander is responsible for a geographical area and area responsibility. So, for example, PACOM is usually a Navy guy, but the Navy isn't doing too well in the Pacific. So I believe they were talking about maybe an Air Force person, even though it's the Pacific. And this Air Force person will command everybody who's assigned to him. And no one can say, wait a minute, I don't have one of you people. I want to join the military, not the Air Force. You can't say that, because that is their command responsibilities derived from that. So you have this world, and it's broken up into various responsibilities. The CENTCOM commander, that's the one to get. That's where all the fun is. As you'll notice here, our usual area of recent busyness. There's an AFRICOM, that's the newest. NORTHCOM is for the defense of the United States. SOUTHCOM is, of course, Central America and South America. And EUCOM is big. And PACOM is PACOM. And it looks like they divided the Antarctic. One of the things happening in Antarctica and the Arctic is that they're getting more, how can we say, warm? So there may be, if someone was to say one of the big military issues, may be competition over the previously frozen areas. It's a diplomatic way of putting it. So that's it. So the responsibility, there's a person in command, and the idea is that when something happens, they have all the plans. I'm head of Central Command, I'm in Tampa, actually. I'm here, and I tell everyone, theoretically, I task everyone, particularly in this force comm, in the Army and the Navy and the Marines and everywhere I need, they don't always listen to me 100%, to get me what I need. I send them a little laundry list, or a grocery list. I need a Army Corps, I need a MEF, I need a strike capability. Now this can be different. Sometimes I say I need so many air wings, I need so many, if I'm near the shore, I need the Navy with cruise missiles, and that's how you do it. The warfighter is the person who's tasked with the air responsibility. And that's what you call. The CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, again, this is the acronym AFRICOM, EUCOM, NORTHCOM, PACOM, SOUTHCOM, and their responsibilities are just that way. And there's their headquarters. SOCOM, Special Operations Command, is a new command that was made up to specialize in, it's a way of saying, here's Special Operations Command, here's money, and here's more people who think about you and your operations, and they will plan them. Now they often work with they don't fight a war on their own, but they're like TRANSCOM, Transportation, and Strategic Command, which work with the joint fighters. So there's kind of a specialization of a function. So the Central Command commander has a multi-service force. So in Iraq, say your Army Central Command, RCENT, MARCENT, NAVCENT, APCENT. And they talk like this, they don't say Army Central Command. You're gonna hear this. Well, the CENTCOM command, the CENTCOM, RCENT, and MARCENT are meeting with NAVCENT and APCENT, and they're gonna go, and they just go into this acronym fest. You're laughing, Tiffany, right? Acronym fest will have your head explode. So you better be kind of familiar with that. Now the Navy's actually worse. SIGNAV Europe. Commander-in-Chief, Navy Europe, SIGNAV Europe, and they make it one word, and you better catch it. ComSub PAC, Command Summary Pacific. Now, wait a minute. I know, I've been watching TV, and there's this people called the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Okay. Then you got another set of folks. Joint Chiefs of Staff is the chairman, the vice chairman, the chief of staff of the Army, the chief of naval operations, the chief of staff of the Air Force, the Common and Marine Corps, and the newest member, the chief of the National Guard. The chairman, who's the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, is the senior military advisor to the President. He is not in charge of all of some forces. So you have the people who run the services, and actually the Commandant of the Marine Corps is relatively recent addition, but the most recent Marine Corps wasn't. Because remember the Marine Corps, I should have mentioned this, the Marine Corps is part of the Department of the Navy, which is not the best thing to be, because sometimes your budget priorities may not be as high, but you are it's part of the Navy. It's the Department of the Navy, and you can see the joy, rapturous joy.
I like my Navy now. They're really fun.
So yes, for Marines, about this relationship. So here we go. The chairman is a Marine. All services have had the job. So you have the first, Omar Bradley, the most historical, Colin Powell. The Navy has had the role. The Air Force has had the role. And there's the medals. And you can read medals. Like the Navy has a lot of things, for example, that will be excellence. It means you did really good on a cruise. The Air Force does tend to give away more medals than the other services. Just a few. So yes. So there's a Purple Heart on Colin Powell's chest. So yes. So these are the senior military advisor to the president. And the SecDef, I guess I should say too. But they're not like Chief War Dog. The final twist. Now that I've confused everything. The services don't fight. The Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman doesn't really run anything. None of these people are in charge. Civilian authority in the military is law and the fundamental basis of Military 101. The services are part of the Department of Defense. The responsibility of the Secretary of Defense is the SecDef in charge of DOD. So you see DOD. You get to DC, Washington, DOD, one word. So the SecDef of DOD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, civilians who are political appointees run the military. None of those people do. No, they do what they told. Everyone has this thing, well, military, well, why did they go to, didn't they go to Iraq? I can tell you the Army wasn't worried really to go to Iraq. Having been in Washington in 2003, they're about as thrilled about it as, I don't know. They're not there. The civilian authorities tell them what to do. Now, can they talk to them and tell them and make their statement? Yes. But it's civilian authority. All the services together with the military and civilian leadership, all the civilians who work for joint services, joint commanders, civilians make policy. They decide the controversial issue. They like to ban gay service members or something, or to not ban them or let them go. If they say, if the president says we allow gay people to serve in the military. Now the military, he might want to work with them and understand their problem and say, well, could you please give me, write a report on how this would affect your service. But he can also say, well, yeah, baby, they're yours. Most presidents try to work with their expertise, but it's irrelevant. They can tell them to do whatever they want to do. Now, it's about money, honey, because civilians control the money. Now, they write the budget, but who is enumerated, and everyone talks about the commander-in-chief, and we all know he's commander-in-chief, the president, but who raises the money? The commander-in-chief, I should say, is above the Secretary of Defense, and he is the ultimate civilian authority over the services. But who writes the checks? Constitutionally, who writes the checks for the military?
It's Congress.
Congress. This is a power they seem to forget all the time. When they say, I don't like that war, and I'm always like, well, then don't write the check. Because that war ain't gonna go on 5 more minutes after you decide that they get no money. If you keep giving it money, it will go on. So everyone says, we don't declare war, what do we do? And I go, don't send the check. It's not real hard. When they say the president's budget, yes, the president proposes a budget for the military. He doesn't force it on them. So everyone wants money. The services, joint commanders, all fight for money for their separate services or for their war plans. They have a certain opinion about what they think should be prioritized. The Office of the Secretary of Defense, OSD, civilians decide who wins. They submit a budget with the President's approval to Congress, who holds the power of the purse to approve, disapprove, or change the allocations. So services say we need this. The Office of the Secretary of Defense decides between the priorities. The President says yay or nay, and he submits the budget to Congress, and Congress does what it will. Now, you have to decide with and across services. So, do you research and develop new weapons? Do you buy weapons you already have developed? Do you maintain the ones you have? Do you train service members to use them? Do you pay service members on active and reserve duty? Do you have them on the books? So I want to design a Death Star. That's research. And it has to be research money. You can't say, well, I'm not going to spend this money they gave me on fuel. I'll design a Death Star. You'll be on a Death Star. That's bad. Darth Vader of Congress will go. Research money for research. Buy an F-35 acquisition. Spare parts and fuel for an F-15, operations and maintenance. Pay enough airmen to maintain F-35s and F-15s. And honestly, this movie, you can reprogram it, but you're supposed to, the money is color money, research color, acquisition color, operations and maintenance color money. So that's how you do the budget. Sounds, I'm already falling asleep. But here comes the excitement. Within services, across DOD, there's all of these issues. So the services like brand new equipment, fancy. They don't like old equipment. They can try to keep personnel, they do as personnel as low as possible because the volunteer military is enormously expensive. Do you know that a private in World War II had $72? And that's not much. And now a military personnel, and with other things like TRICARE for life or retirement, you're getting a bill for quite some time. I'm not saying no one deserves it, but does or doesn't, that's irrelevant. When you run the budget figures for the end strength, you have to put in how many people you're going to keep on, how much they're going to cost in the long term. Now, non-glamorous support logistic units personnel lose because no one wants to say you bought 50,000 trucks. And often when the war comes, that's the kind of things you're short of. Now let's look at these two buddies. This is an F-35. It's gleaming. Isn't it? Shiny. It's like a sci-fi novel, right? This is an A-10. This plane is old as dirt. Its function is to support the Army. Enemy. Now, what does the Air Force like best?
35s.
Yes! Congress, they went to Congress, you know, they're so old. We don't need those A-10s anymore. Why do we need them? We've got these cool F-35s, which I'm sure will be able to support the Army, even though we don't have that in specs. But, so the Congress, they actually, DOD tried to say mix. However, Congress knows that these have been very useful in, I don't know, stuff like what we're doing now. Now, theoretically, China might build fighters, and we need air supremacy and all that. Right now, what we do right now, this is needed. It's unglamorous, it's dull, it's slow, and it's what's delivering. So they told the Air Force for the 300th time, I think they try to get rid of the A-10 every 3 or 6 months. No, you're keeping it. Last I heard, they were keeping it. Now, if you want to read something funny, the Duffel blog, the military satire on the internet, and they have some very hysterical things about the F-35, including it being beaten by...
F-16.
No, well, it was beaten by an F-16 in reality.
The
Red Baron from Snoopy beating it. It's hysterical. They're not, I think they're A-10 pilots that won that. They're dogged on the F-35. Now here's the thing. The defense budget is 1/2 or better at times the discretionary defense budget. And you're like, well, there's a budget that's non-discretionary. You gotta pay Social Security and all this other stuff. And there's parks and interior and food stamps and education, and all that other stuff, that's discretionary. You can go up or down. It's half. The next budget isn't finalized. I think we're closer to this number, $700 billion, which is a dramatic increase. So, that's why you need to know. When people don't know anything about the military, you've got to be analytical. Because one of the things when they start talking about what they're going to spend it on, what you buy matters, what you don't buy matters more, in some ways. And the services mean well, but they often have their own prejudices. For example, fighter pilots for a long time ran the Air Force. They bought fighters. That's why B-52s are still flying. I think we're getting down to the great-grandson will be flying, the first original flyers. I know they've rebuilt it, and it's a new ship, but that's neither here nor there. Now, the next slides are the first and last day of service for a weapon system the U.S. thought would be the key to world power. We're going to buy one thing. In 1910, one thing. I'm going to buy this because it's awesome. And everyone will run in fear from us when we buy this. There it is. It's first day in New York. It's been launched. Doesn't it look awesome? Are you frightened? We oddly enough have its last day of service. The picture. You can get to it. There it is. It's Arizona. Battleships were going to deliver. Nations spent enormous amount of monies on them. They ratcheted up world tension. And American battleships at most will pull next to islands in World War II and blast them. And you'll still have to go in and kill all the Japanese in the caves. I don't know if that was a substantial expenditure of a very limited defense budget before World War I. It was seen as the answer. And the world changed. You had airplanes, aircraft. We developed aircraft carriers between the wars. I'm not saying we were totally devoted to battleships, but we put on that was the future, and it wasn't. So, at the end of all these calculations, the American soldier, sailor, airman, marine, and to these men and women, this is why we did this. So everyone outside would understand.